Welcome here, friends. Welcome to St. Mark's College and the Center for Christian Engagement. My name is John Martins, the director of the Center for Christian Engagement, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We're thankful for their welcome so that we can live, learn, work, and pray on their land. It's our goal that the Center for Christian Engagement become a source of healing and reconciliation by examining the past truthfully, accompanying those who are suffering today, acting compassionately, humbly, and wisely as we move forward together. The Center for Christian Engagement is a center at St. Mark's College, the Catholic college at the University of British Columbia, that emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we explore the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition and learn from others and their traditions. I want to say that we're so thankful for the Cullen family who makes these lectures possible here at the center and at the colleges. And I want to thank our generous donors to the Center for Christian Engagement, Peter Bull, Angus Reid, and Andy Zox. We're thankful for their commitment to the life of the academic world and the work of the church in the world. I'm thankful for those of you who are here with us in person today, and for the many, many more who are joining us virtually. As we continue to navigate sort of a new normal of a pandemic / post-pandemic world, I will, at the end of the lecture, manage your questions via the Q&A function for those of you who are watching from home or wherever you are. And Father Rixon will handle the in-person questions here this evening. So let me say something about the speaker before I turn it over to him. Gordon Rixon, SJ, is Associate Professor in Systematic Theology at, and I think this is a pretty long title, Regis College, St. Michael's College, Catholic Federation in the Toronto School of Theology at the University of Toronto. There will be a quiz at the end, and is in fact the president designate of Regis College now. Congratulations. He holds a BA in philosophy and statistical theory from Gonzaga University, not too far from here, an MDiv, STB, and STL from Regis College, and a PhD from Boston College. Gordon Rixon's A Slain Lamb Standing, Remembering the Future of Religion in Post-Secular Canada, joins Bernard Lonergan, a famed Jesuit Catholic theologian, in recognizing the inadequacy of populist responses, whether energized by the now fragmented right or the scattered left, to contemporary social challenges. Acknowledging Christianity's role in the colonizing expansion of European powers into the Western Hemisphere, he draws on the Ignatian spiritual ground of Lonergan's methodology to challenge a toxic notion of the common good that dissimulates the seizure of the lands, the destruction of indigenous languages and cultures, and the expansion of empire. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you. It's delightful to be here to see some friends, and I'm sure over the course of the evening to meet some new people. So I'm very, very grateful to spend this time with you. I think gratitude is as we'll see over the course of my remarks and perhaps our interaction, that gratitude is just a wonderful disposition for creating stories about our lives. Yeah, gratitude is just a wonderful disposition And I'm going to talk a lot this evening around creating stories, constructing narratives about who we are and what our journeys are. And every story has a disposition. So if we could maybe enter into the space and disposition of gratitude, I think that's a good way to approach the evening. I appreciate the land acknowledgement that has been presented, and I travel from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca and the Mississauga of the Credit River to join you today. We meet this evening on land that is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I'm grateful to have this time with you. The evening's presentation will touch on some difficult issues, and some people may find that distressing. So I encourage you to make good choices about how you engage, to be aware that sometimes it's necessary to control how much engagement you have good strategies about how to walk with things, to reach out to friends and make use of resources. So I just think it's important that we need to be, as the believing communities, present to the wounds of the world and to the wounds of the church, but we also need to walk gently and care for one another and ourselves along the way. The scripture I have for this evening is Revelations 5. And they, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and every language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on earth." The 4th week of the spiritual exercises, the first time I made a Jesuit, the first time I made the spiritual exercises, I think I was 19. And what did I know about life at that point? It was kind of preparing me perhaps for the future. And the 4th week in particular in the Ignatian exercises is about the resurrection. And for me, the first experience I had of the 4th week was kind of flat. I thought it was going to be this extraordinary, marvelous, everything is perfect and joyous and full of God's glory sort of experience. And it wasn't. It was kind of flat. But the second time I made the exercises many, many years later, decades later, and perhaps had gotten a few wounds along the way, I realized that the 4th week of the exercises was about the slain lamb standing. Yes, joyous. Yes, indeed resurrected from the Paschal event, but still bearing the wounds of the cross and being present to the world. And I think what I hope over the course of the evening that we can do is be attentive to the moment in which we find ourselves and be aware that the consolation of the resurrection has very much to do with being present to the world in its woundedness. That there in the exercises, the first week, the grace of the first week, Ignatius talks about shame and confusion as being a grace, if you can imagine. But shame and confusion, I think, in the sense that can be the real moment, the real place in which we meet God. I had an encounter with one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, in Winnipeg. Oh, it must have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago now. It was in a small group conversation among people who were involved with the church's response to the TRC process. And she was kind of scolding one of the representatives, not a Catholic representative, but it could very well have been a Catholic representative, about the difficulty of the slowness they were experiencing in raising the donations to be part of the reconciliation process. And I somewhat came to my colleague's defense and said, well, you have to remember the church deals with volunteers. And when a collection is being taken up, people are making their choices. And people thought that they had been involved in something that was good and holy and of God, and they are discovering that it was not, and that in fact it was evil. And people being confronted by that evil in the world experience shame and confusion. And she said to me, well, that's how the survivors feel. And I responded, hope not too quickly. Well, that's a good place to actually start this conversation, is that we feel together shame and confusion. And in the exercises, the movement goes from that radical acknowledgement of evil and our response to it, but then to liberating sorrow. And sorrow is liberating, and I'm going to talk about that in the course of the evening. And then liberating sorrow, in a sense, allows us to reconstruct a narrative about the event, and I'm going to explore that. That helps us perhaps then to move forward to some sort of transforming response and action. So there is, I think, here an invitation to find ourselves grounded, to pay attention, to know our context and our reality. Then just to continue along that vein for just a moment. So of course, for me, this is in a sense, and I wonder for each of us, as we appropriate our own story and we become grounded in our own history, what we might discover. When I was a boy, I used to play with musket balls that my great uncle would plow up from his farmer's field at Queenston Heights in Ontario, which is where one of the battles of the War of 1812. And I had a sock full of musket balls. Now, probably not very wise since they were lead, but this was before the awareness of toxicity of lead and that children shouldn't be sort of having access to these things, but we would play marbles with the musket balls. And it was some years later that I realized, I think I'm in my late teens, that one of my great aunts was relating to us how she had cut up this old army uniform that was in the family, that was one of my ancestors' battle dress from the War of 1812. And so I realized that one of my ancestors had fought alongside, and it's only relatively recently that we acknowledged that it was the Haudenosaunee and the Delaware that came to the rescue of the British in the War of 1812. And so I suspect for many of us that there are relationships, there are moments of our own biographies and histories that are deeply, deeply implicated and invite us to pay attention to relationships. So if you go to Queenston Heights today and recently, you'll see a memorial not just to the British, but also to the Haudenosaunee and the Delaware and John Norton who led them. And similarly, I think something is true for us as communities. And so one of the things that I recall as being a Jesuit novice is one of the old fathers, a wonderful, gentle gentleman by the name of Ray Oliver, who used to sort of be the grandfather figure in the community, had been the principal of the Jesuit residential school at Spanish, Ontario. And that he had introduced a high school curriculum, the first high school curriculum to one of these schools in Canada. And he would speak with great pain about the closure of the school and the sense of abandonment of the people. There are connections here, right? And then to sort of continue on, when I was the dean of Regis College and we were moving the college, I discovered that we had 5,000 books in our library that were from the old library at the Spanish school. The relationships, the context is there. The Jesuits, at many places in Canada now, the Jesuits are involved with about 4 different communities, searching through records, trying to give a full and accurate account of the deaths at the school. And so there is, I think, for us, if we pay attention and we allow ourselves to really acknowledge that there is a context here in which we really are invited and encouraged to be able to think about these things and then raise the question, what is the role of our faith? How does a person of faith respond today in a way that will be life-giving? And so the context. In a lecture entitled Dimensions of Meaning, delivered in May of 1965 at Marquette University as part of a distinguished lecture series, the Canadian Jesuit philosopher and theologian Bernard Lonergan remarked, "Classical culture cannot be jettisoned without being replaced, and what replaces it cannot but run counter to classical expectations. There is bound to be formed a solid right that is determined to live in a world that no longer exists. There is bound to be formed a scattered left, captivated by now this, now that new development, exploring now this and now that new possibility. But what counts is perhaps, what will count is perhaps not the not numerous center, big enough to be at home in both the old and the new, painstaking enough to work out one by one the transitions to be made, strong enough to refuse half measures and insist on complete solutions, even though it has to wait." 1965. And my observation here is that I think this is a real moment. It's like an eddy in a flow, a cascading flow of cultural development. What it means to have a world in which there is one normative culture for everyone. Think a little bit of colonization there. And then what it means to come to grips with the fact that there are many different cultures. In my 40 years of studying and teaching theology, I've come to understand Lonergan's remark as a reflective eddy in a cascading flow of cultural development and transformation of religion's role in Western societies. A few months before the Second Vatican Council entered its 4th and final session, Lonergan reflects on rejecting a normative notion of culture. This forerunner to globalization had shaped Roman Catholicism and colonized large areas of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Such a monolithic approach drew economic progress, disciplined adherence of religious doctrine, and canonical culture into a universal whole cloth from which regional elites cut national variants. In December of 1965, just a few months after Lonergan's remarks, the Vatican Council document Gaudium et Spes affirmed people's right to culture. This seismic document signaled the Church's dawning willingness to face the diverse, complex beauty of the world's cultures and begin a process of profound reflection on the role of religion amid mondialisation. Now, it's very interesting. In Spanish and in French, they have 2 words for globalization. One is a monoculture that would encompass the world, and the other is about a cosmopolitan acknowledgement of the complexity of the world's various cultures. And if you want a little hint, this is what Francis is coming from in this is, he has a Spanish mentality here. When he talks about the polyhedron, he's talking about what the French would call mondialisation. So over my years of teaching, I have noticed 4 cohorts of students shaped by what I would characterize as distinct primary life concerns. The first cohort, who had experienced the pre-Vatican II church, yes, I am old enough to have had students shaped by the pre-Vatican II church. They had grappled with change in what they had perceived as eternal, stable, and even a static church. These students were challenged by historical consciousness as they encountered the modern methods of scriptural interpretation and critical church history. How could there be multiple authors of the Pauline literature? What do you mean that the Bishop of Rome became known as the Vicar of Peter in the 5th century and the Vicar of Christ at the end of the 13th century? Theology professors and students alike were learning their history and abandoning anachronisms, and the reviews were mixed. The second cohort arrived some years later. These were the Gen X and the millennials who had only known change and experienced life as a series of disconnected episodes. They struggled to locate themselves amid the cultural rejection of meta-narratives. History had neither flow nor actors. Students lived in the moment and yearned for a sense of place. The third and the fourth cohorts appeared in quicker succession. Mobilized by their ennui with epistodic existence, the third cohort equated and rejected cultural pluralism as the equivalent of moral relativism. These were the young conservatives, all too easily boxed and dismissed by progressive but aging boomers. As I listened to these students' complaints with openness and empathy about progressive Catholics, I always reminded them that they were talking about my people. A generation who promoted the essential relation of faith and justice and coined the inspirational tag about a faith that does justice, a motto that I readily expand to a faith that does justice and appreciates beauty. The fourth cohort, I must admit, has won over my now gently genitive heart. These students are the children of Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. Without question, they embrace pluralism as a gift, a beautiful expression of God's bounty. Casting aside earlier suspicions about relativism, present-day students accept diversity as expanding the cultural bandwidth of communication to receive the eternal mystery of the gospel. An interplay of word and spirit charging a rich array of symbols and linguistic resources unfolding in the flow of history. These students have self-awareness, self-knowledge, freedom, and openness. But amid accepted and cherished cultural diversity, they struggle with identity. For them, the question is, where do I belong? How do I contribute to building a kingdom of grace and justice? Now, you might wonder how I came to recognize this most recent cohort. After describing my insights about the previous three, I simply asked them, what is your gift and your struggle? And they told me with insight and confidence. Lonergan's 1965 observations about the solid right, the scattered left, and the not too numerous center are couched primarily within the historical consciousness dawning in the post-Vatican II church. Of course, his empirical notion of culture extends to acknowledge the cultural differences that emerge within a culture over time, and those arising from the meanings and values embraced by different peoples, diverse peoples, who today often share the same social spaces. In the contemporary context, the confluence of pluralism, hybridity, and intersectionality marks diversity. Differences that once played out sequentially in melodies, one note following another, now sound together in harmony and discordance. It might seem overly subtle, but religion must rediscover its location and a way in these new and not so new realities. By 1972, Lonergan had described theology as a reflection on the role of religion within a culture. But if Western culture had acknowledged historical consciousness, it was still struggling to recognize cultural pluralism as a gift to be appreciated with discernment and not simply reduced to a worrisome relativism to be resisted. One of my, I don't know, are we allowed as theologians to have hobbies? One of my hobbies has been, as I go along with my classes, and I have students, as many of you other instructors, I'm sure would also share, from all around the world and speaking many languages. And one of the things I enjoy is getting them to identify the word for justice in their native language, and then to begin to think about how would you contextualize and explain to me, an Anglo, how your culture understands the notion of justice. And it is remarkable about the diversity. And it's just an example that when we think that the gospel is integrally related to justice, and if you have all these different notions of justice around the world, how rich that is, but also how challenging it is, and how easy it would be to overlook significant differences. The Odawa word for justice is goyako, which is about finding balance. And the image, the primary image, is literally balance in a canoe. And if you're aware of the grandfather teaching the 7 values of the culture, it is, in a sense of how do you find balance among the different values and proceed that way. It's remarkable. I have a student from India now who is tracking through 18 language groups to identify the different notions of justice and how they are interrelated. So it's just an example of the richness and the bandwidth that is opened up for receiving the gospel. Concurrent with this acknowledgement of cultural pluralism, varieties of secularism have emerged. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has described 3 forms of secularism. First is the fragmentation of self-contained social spheres, some secular and some religious, where each occupies its own distinct space. Second, a simple reduction of religious practice with no claim of any particular significance. And third, assertive disbelief that would marginalize the practice of religion and claim its autonomy over against the sovereignty of God and the rule of religion. In Taylor's estimation, disbelief was unusual in the 14th century. In contrast, belief has become less common and more difficult in modern times. The path of this journey, in his telling, is reflected in the story of the Enlightenment as religion and science have sorted out their respective domains and relations. Taylor's account of the varieties and the rise of secularism is helpful, but other authors, such as Jose Casanova, suggest that the story about secularism in Western democracies is not a global experience. The Enlightenment story does not account for the journey to modernity in every land. Different cultures and peoples have traveled different paths to multiple modernities. The relationships between faith and scientific reason is different in the United States, Canada, Vietnam, India, France, and Venezuela, for instance. What is broadly true in Canada and many other regions is that Christianity and many other religious traditions have lost their assumed social privilege. In Canada, the genocidal residential school system, the misconduct at Mount Cashel, and many other locations, and the loss of shared transcendent rituals have devastated religion's social capital. Accompanying the complex advent of secularism we might highlight three influences. The three are the association of religion with colonialism, the scandal of clergy sexual misconduct, and the reduction of religion to its sociological function of promoting group cohesion. Now let's consider for a moment the third. Religion is and always has been ambiguous. Sometimes we take the idea of enclosure as an architectural feature of monasteries and a literary device much too literally. Suppose you've had an experience in religious communities and some reflective self-knowledge. In that case, if you are like me, a moment's reflection assures us that good and evil are present in the world, in the church, in faith communities, and in the self. The challenge, the task, is to adopt a self-critical stance, discern the difference, and allow continuous discernment to correct our perceptions and guide our actions. But the notion of enclosure draws our attention to another reality that shares this ambiguity more subtly, which touches on identity and belonging. To sort out this ambiguity, we must distinguish and then return to interrelate religion's sociological and transcendent functions. The sociological role of religion is to bring about group cohesion. You may be familiar with an anthropologist named Robin Dunbar. There is a phenomenon called Dunbar's number, which is about social organization. You need a different strategy to facilitate group cohesion whenever you increase the group size. It tends to go by threes, 5, 15, 45, and so on. Primates can maintain a cohesive troop size of about 45 through fingertip grooming. But how many other monkeys can you groom in the course of a day, right? We can develop more sophisticated approaches with more advanced cognitive skills. Choral singing and Christmas card lists are examples. Singing enables sympathetic breathing, which is a very effective bonding practice. Christmas card lists usually max out at about 150, which is about the broadest circle of friends that we can maintain, Facebook notwithstanding. Another strategy is to bind people together through shared meanings and values, which religion can convey and support very effectively. But here is the double rub. As a group cohesion strategy, religion can bind people together or drive them apart. Enclosure can signal welcoming hospitality or be a cruel instrument of social exclusion. Religion can incite violence or be an instrument of reconciliation and peacemaking. And further, here is the second rub. Religion has a transcendent function that invites us to a higher divine purpose. While religion legitimately and necessarily recognizes our profoundly social nature, the purpose of religion goes beyond the security of belonging to a social group to praise, reverence, and serve the Creator God. Even as the transcendent function of religion affirms the right to culture, the value of social identity, and belonging to a tradition, the transcendent function's divine purpose remains beyond the grasp of any tradition, culture, or language. I'm spiritual, but not religious, is a common remark relevant to our discussion and invites discussion to clarify how popular culture identifies and positions the two functions of religion. I observe that some, perhaps many or most, people who want to make this claim think of religion negatively. Understandably, who would not want to distance themselves from the social cohesion structures of groups associated with exclusion, violence, and privilege, especially in the Canadian context of genocidal residential schools and clergy sexual misconduct? Spirituality offers an attractive, alternative, reflective path to interior freedom and self-critical growth for those who either intuitively or with fully conscious deliberation embrace the transcendent function of religion. The challenge, of course, is that we are social beings. Identity, belonging, shared meanings and values are as essential as they are fragile and potentially tainted. Should individualistic spirituality attempt to usurp the transcendent function of religion and erect the literal wall of a new enclosure, the ambiguity of the human situation is reinforced, not resolved. As the tagline suggests, fighting the enemy without feeds the enemy within, an enemy who then thrives unrecognized and unchecked. To have a holistic spirituality, we must embrace the social quality of our humanity, address the ambiguity of the group cohesion process, and then make good choices. The transcendent and sociological functions of religion are inextricably intertwined. If spirituality teaches us that we do not save ourselves, religion teaches us that God does not save us without us. We are social beings, and God saves us as social beings. True enough, the church is not an institution. Still, it has institutions, and we must assume the responsibility to work together and with grace to make them healthy institutions. Our charge is to probe this intertwining of religion's sociological and transcendent dimensions. Now that we have journeyed so far in our conversation, we will simply refer to the sociological function as religion and the transcendent function as spirituality. We resist any temptation to reduce one to the other or locate either in a separate enclosure. The opportunity and the challenge are to appreciate how we are guided and transformed as social beings by serving divine purpose. Oddly, in the rest of this presentation, social theory will elucidate religion, and spiritual practices will exemplify social theory. Still, we constantly address religion, spirituality, and social theory as theologically guided and corrected. Well, let's see how it goes. We only have time to probe one application of social theory to the interaction of religion and spirituality. So I will focus on trauma-informed spiritual accompaniment. To accomplish this, I ask you to walk with me through 3 steps. First, I will draw on the work of Judith Herman to introduce some fundamental ideas about trauma and recovery. Second, I apply trauma theory to redescribe the Ignatian spiritual practice of the an examination of consciousness. And I conclude by highlighting the significance of adopting a trauma-informed approach to the examen and its implications for retrieving a self-aware, self-critical, religious spirituality that weaves religion's sociological and transcendent functions in deliberate transformative practice. Trauma is an overwhelming event. Trauma disrupts communication between our embodiment and the conscious exercise of our autonomous agency that shapes the stories we tell about ourselves and to others about our own identities. I'm going to, at some point, see if I can tie some of this into a philosopher by the name of Merleau-Ponty. And it's just really important to realize that how we are embodied, right? And our ability to be rational, to have cognitive functions is profoundly grounded in our embodiment. And so I just invite you to think about the experience you've had of infants. If you ever put your newborn finger near the hand, what happens? It latches, right? And sometimes we might think that grasping is a more sophisticated function than pointing. But as a matter of fact, if you look at early childhood development, children can grasp before they can point. It's an interesting observation. And what's happening is that pointing is actually a variation in a development of the grasping instinct. And what it's signaling is that the embodiment is being reorganized by the cognitive development that allows the possibility of comprehending possibility. And pointing is an expression of grasping possibility, which is a higher cognitive function, but it is, again, going to reorganize the infant's embodiment. So hang on to that, okay? Just because we want to keep saying that we are integrally organized as human beings. This disruption, the disruption of trauma, so we should be one slide ahead. I think, yeah. This this disruption touches on three potential dimensions of our response to threat. First, the freeze response is the most primitive, spontaneous, precognitive, neurologically based reaction to a threatening sensation. Hairs stand on our bodies in heightened sensitivity, and we become motionless to avoid detection. Second, the fight-flight response reflects the development of our sensibility to mobilize an active physical response to avoid or overcome threat. The fight-flight response exercises a measure of spontaneous agency with some measure of cognitive activity. And finally, social outreach is a response that enlists social networks for active and emotional support. Social outreach assumes fuller cognitive engagement, which can shape strategic activism for systemic structural change. Trauma potentially disrupts each of these responses. Sensations associated with threat can become disassociated from the originating event and intrude at unexpected moments, often triggered by disconnected sensible stimuli. An inability to integrate the disassociated event into the narration of a story about oneself can compromise a person's agency and identity. Avoiding the distress of triggering stimuli can restrict a person's outreach to supportive social networks. Herman refers to a dialectic of trauma experienced in the contention between the hypervigilance in response to everyday sensation and the restriction of social activity to avoid triggering situations. Herman identifies three cascading moments in the recovering process from trauma. The first moment is establishing a sense of safety within a physically safe environment. The second moment involves survivors retrieving their agency and identity through telling their story on their own terms about the event and memorializing any loss. The third moment witnesses the person reestablishing their social network, sometimes empowering social activism that addresses the perpetration to remedy a social situation and take steps to prevent the recurrence of injury. Although there is a sequence implied by the three moments, the moments do not flow rigidly one upon another. There can be cycling back to deepen and reintegrate an earlier moment, considering subsequent accomplishments. This first moment is the most likely to require active intervention from a caregiver, and depending on the profundity and duration of the traumatic experience, may require an extended period of active supportive care. Yet, the work of the second and third moments belongs properly only to the survivor in recovery. An accompanier may offer some information about the recovery process. Still, the recovery work remains with survivors as they reactivate their agency by narrating their experiences and memorializing their losses. An accompanier perhaps would bear witness to that process, but they can't do it for the person in recovery. They assert their agency over the events by telling their own story. Likewise, by regulating the work of recovery, they differentiate sensation, memories, narratives, and identity, and reestablish constructive communication between their physical embodiment and cognition. Sensation, memory, and stories are experiences someone has. They do not define persons or their identities. Beyond understanding the path to recovery, there is an implicit performance that it itself affects the recovery. Now, considering these three interlocking moments on the path to recovery from trauma, establishing basic safety, exercising agency through narration and memorialization, and transforming action, let's reflect on the Ignatian Examen. The Examen is a daily spiritual practice that unfolds in 5 moments as practitioners review and evaluate the meaning and direction of the movements of the events and their responses to the events of their day. The basic form of the exercise is constructing a narrative that assigns meaning and projects responsive action into the future. The first 2 steps include asking for the general disposition of gratitude and the light of the Holy Spirit to guide reflection. These first 2 elements confirm the basic security of a positive and affirming context for probing the encouraging and discouraging aspects of the day or the period that's under review. The third step moves from what Gregory of Nyssa termed historia and theoria in his Life of Moses. Historia is a relating of the events as episodes, just the facts, without interpretation as to their meaning and significance. Theoria is the contemplation of the causality and the significance of the episodes, an emplotment of events, identifying movements toward or away from deeper union with the sacred, and cooperation or resistance with divine purpose. Events taken together become movements that have meaning in the spiritual journey. The fourth step turns on the frank acknowledgement that there may be events that resist the disposition of gratitude and the illumination of a divine perspective, and defy integration into the flow of a unified narrative. Ignatian practice recommends bringing these moments under the additional light of the Paschal event. The light of the cross that returns good for evil can transform resistive events simply by replacing self-justification and self-promotion with the disposition of sorrow. Remember the first week. The fifth step is the projection of the narrative's trajectory into the future. A renewed journey guided by self-correcting action, considering the path already traveled, the issues identified, the self-knowledge gained, and the interior freedom won. The image of the hand is taken from a 17th century edition of the Spiritual Exercises, where Ignatius has the 5 steps on the fingertips there with little images. I was a Jesuit for an embarrassing number of years before I really alluded to the fact that there are 5 steps to the examen. And finally, I got it. So we need probably to move towards a conclusion so we can have some discussion. So there is an apparent correlation then between the first moment in recovery and the first 2 steps of the examen. Both recognize the importance of the felt assurance of a safe, benevolent environment to frame the exercise of agency through the often difficult task of self-narration. Trauma theory underlines this importance and recognizes that this assurance may require compassionate, supportive intervention. Analogously, the Ignatian and the Christian perspective acknowledge that another gives this assurance. It is the object of not of sharing a prescription, but of petitionary prayer, and elicits active reception and appropriation through gratitude. The observation here and throughout is not doctrinal insight, but heartfelt spiritual practice. Doctrinal insight remains essential, but especially as it completes and raises spiritual practice to heightened awareness and deliberate action. Similarly, the second moment in recovery and the third step in the examen highlight the role of agency. The act of telling the story is itself healing and empowering. Assured in our identities as beheld by another in safety and love, we can hold challenging events in coherent narratives. In the context of the examen, illumined by trauma-informed accompaniment, we might further discover ourselves held in narratives larger than our own. The fourth step of the examen completes the third and leads to the fifth step in recovery. The fourth step of the examen completes the third and leads to the fifth in the examen. The memorialization of loss joins ritual celebration to empower and guide agency. As the source and summit of Christian living, the Eucharist takes on renewed meaning and gratitude, remembrance, and sharing in mission. Restored agency and memorialized loss reaffirm dignity, enliven social networking, and transform community. And so just to conclude, and there's much more that we could explore here in terms of contemplative prayer. There's something incredibly interesting in trauma theory called EMDR, eye movement disassociation and reprocessing. There's a little mouthful for you. And in contemplative prayer, just generally, one of the things you're doing is through the use of the imagination and the visualization exercises, there can be kind of a regrounding in the moment. You can almost think of a, what do they call it, mindfulness meditation type activity where you're aware of your senses. It brings you to the present moment. It creates distance between the self and memories. And being aware, and therapists will do this with folks in recovery, is that they'll literally get them to move their eyes around a room and visualize in a way when they're experiencing the overwhelming recollection of a sensation that they haven't been able to sort of integrate into their story. And it is a way of creating distance so that that use of the eyes. And, you know, in contemplative prayer, we talk about healing of memories. And one of the things you're doing is you are remembering the sensation that is trying to find a way into your self-awareness, into your consciousness, in a way that allows you to reprocess it, to integrate it into a story, to be aware that it's not the present moment, that you're at some distance from it, that you can integrate it into a story that you're telling about yourself and rediscover your agency. Simple little thing like going from shame and confusion to liberating sorrow is reshaping how you remember. And that very reshaping is the restoration of agency that then allows you to project the self into the future. Really simple stuff, but it's very grounded. And I think when you bring social theory and the spiritual tradition together, they inform each other and allow us perhaps to give an account of this that will be of service to the church as it walks through the difficulties of human living and its own humanity in a way that would give hope and some sense of direction into the future. So I'll stop there and perhaps people have remarks or questions that they'd like to pose. Please.
Do you have thoughts on where we are as a society who has experienced the trauma of being isolated for the last 2 years and the social disconnectedness, like the church that I'm attending, we have that frequently, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
The spiritual care aspect of it is not happening really. Things feel very fragmented still.
You know, thank you. That's a great question. And in a way, what you're doing, I think you're pointing towards experience that's very present to many of us. Yeah. And that by reflecting on what is present to us is a wonderful starting point to begin to have a sense of what it means to be present to something and to kind of work with it, right?
You need to repeat the question just so that people on Zoom. Oh, okay.
But good point to check out there, and we want to make sure everybody can participate. So thanks. So, and there, what I would say, a few things to be said, just to appreciate, memories are very spatial. So I know in class when I'm teaching fundamental foundational issues in theology, I always try to get students to work a bit with memory and space. And I don't know, there may be some people here who've had the experience of the young pastor who arrives in a parish that's well established, that has a certain aesthetic in the sanctuary that is not his aesthetic. Right? And so what does the naive, poorly trained young pastor do? Changes the color, moves the altar, shifts the art around. And what's happening is that this space where people have worshiped, where they've celebrated baptisms, marriages, and deaths, is disrupted. And when you disrupt the space, you disrupt the memories. It is profound. And not that you can't do church renovations, but if you do them, you have to do something to honor the memories and reintegrate them into that space. And so in a way, what has the pandemic done to us? And we could elaborate, like even the way you move through a space can have a lot of significance for memory. And memory is formation of identity. It's a way you're holding meaning and values together. So when we have our space disrupted, when we have our movement disrupted, we are literally disrupting meanings, values, identities. And that, I think, is what we have experienced on a social level through the pandemic, right? And so the invitation, I think, people can take responsibility for shaping that. They can learn about it and then shape it, and we can help each other so that there's for instance, a real challenge, I think, for believing communities in ritual to find ways of reintegrating people into space, into memory, and will be really profound opportunity to do pastoral accompaniment. We've been, in a sense, we've been socially traumatized. And think of the steps to recovery and think what it means even to be able to tell a coherent story about what has happened to us. And the inability to tell that coherent story can really affect identity. Right? So you're right on. It's a very good example of kind of what we've been through, and it points to something that's very immediate to people. So thank you for that.